It's always interesting how money draws a crowd. You know, I do the most profound course on earth and 1.5 people show up. And I do a course on money and wow, right away. I hope by the end of these 3 days you get the joke of that, but we'll see. The nature of this money course as it was outlined is that I'm going to take you through the 64 archetypal themes of making money. The 64 archetypal themes of what are material archetypes, unique material archetypes. But before I can go into a long story about running around the wheel and telling you about all the themes that are there in terms of the material, I want to be able to put that into context for you. And I want to put it into a context that is both profound and funny. Looks like his head center's been damaged and bandaged. Poor thing. I feel better that way. Okay. I want you to imagine something for a moment. I want you to just sort of go along with me in this. I want you to take a look at this and imagine that what you're looking at is that you're looking at an organizational chart. You're actually looking at the design of, let's say, a business, but in the most broad sense of the metaphor, okay? So you're looking at a design of an organization, and basically in looking at that design, what we're looking at is not the whole business. What we're looking at is how the business and where the business makes money. And if you're looking at this whole chart about how the business makes money, the thing to recognize, even the spirits want to make money. You have to recognize that each of the centers, what they really represent in this context is each of them is a profit center. Each of them is a profit center. So when you're looking at this organism, what you're looking at is you're looking at 9 profit centers. Okay, so by the time after the mid-break today, when I start going through the gates, okay, we're going to be able to discuss the gates because I'm going to go through the gates, not through the wheel, not through their numbers, but I'm going to go through the gates according to center so that we can see each of these profit centers and the themes of the profit centers. All right. Now, let's talk about something really funny, okay? Really funny. Think about your design. When you're looking at your design, what you're looking at is that you're looking at differentiation imprinting. Remember that, very important. Every cell in your body can replicate you, cloning. Every cell in your body has all the information of all of you. The thing that makes a muscle cell different than a blood cell is that it's imprinted to do one function, even though it carries all the other information. So when you're looking at your body graph, you're looking at your differentiated imprinting out of the matrix of all of what is the chemistry of life. It is your specific imprinting, it's what makes you different, it's what makes you unique. However, you have to recognize that every single open center and every single open gate and every single open channel is rooted in receptors within you to that. In other words, what I call the shadow or the not-self. In other words, we as an entity are made up of 2 things. We're made up of a specific imprinting, and that specific imprinting is imprinted out of, if you will, a very complex matrix in which we have receptors to everything else. So when you have a gate that's open, basically what you have is a receptor. And that receptor is not only attracted to what's on the other side, but it pulls the other side to it because it's the nature of our geometry. In other words, whatever is open in you is going to meet what activates it. And whatever is open in you means that that is your shadow's imprinting. In other words, where your shadow is designed to be attractive. Remember everything I've taught you about genetics. Everything about genetics is rooted in the fact that we are designed to be attracted to what is different. And of course, there lies our dilemma. We are attracted to the realm of the not-self. Now, the thing to recognize is that that is not a one-way street. What we are attracted to, we meet. And what we meet is attracted and interesting for us, and we take from that meeting something. See, look. Your differentiated imprint doesn't know how to make money. Doesn't need to know how to make money. Isn't fucking interested in making money. You see, when you live the true differentiated self, everything is there. There's nothing to look for. It's very different. It's not about being attracted to it. It simply happens to be in the environment. And unless you're awake, you don't appreciate that. Okay. And we do not live in an awake world. We live in a world of the not-self. What needs to make money is the not-self. What needs to demonstrate that it is superior to its inadequacies is the not-self. What is important in order to demonstrate that one is of value? It's the not-self. Everything about the material life as we live it, that is the material life in which 500 beings earn as much money in 1 year as 2 billion on this planet. Now this is the dysfunction of the not-self. Nobody needs to earn $1 million a month. Nobody. 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 That is, nobody in terms of the true self. Oh, but the not-self? Yes, please. 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 So the first thing I want you to understand is something very simple. You make money out of the not-self. You make money through the not-self. That it is the not-self that brings material benefit to you. This is one of the great jokes of money courses. You know, many of you are longtime students of mine. You know how resistant I've been to teaching courses about money. You know, because it wasn't time. People would not have understood what this really means. You see, the way in which we have material anxiety in this life is all rooted on the fact that it's all based on the not-self. It's all illusion. It's all based on the not-self. How much suffering comes on the material plane? It's extraordinary. But then again, it's only a simple mirror of the pain of what life is itself. Anyway, okay, so look. We have nine profit centers. And we're only going to see them as profit centers because we're going to look at 9 open centers. Right? Okay, now look. Let's have some fun with numbers. Right? Think about it this way. You're running the company and you're looking at the figures. And you're looking at the various departments that you have that are your 9 profit centers. And you really want to see, which one is the one that's really holding the company together, which one is really doing well. What's it all about? Now let's take a look. Let's start with the head center. 29% of humanity have the head center defined. 29%. That means 71% of humanity, 4.3 billion people. Please get the number. 4.3 billion people have an open head center. Think about that. Now remember, we know the strategy of the open head center is that you're always trying to answer questions that aren't important to you. And that your mind, your mental plane, which is going to take the not self and propagandize it, the mind is going to say, no, darling, I can't make love to you. I'm trying to figure out this great question. No, I can't take that job right now. I'm trying to figure out this great question. No, I can't do this because I'm trying to figure out this great question, right? Okay, now think about this. Think about the department of the head center. What do we sell in the head center? Right, we sell inspiration. And what is the biggest business on earth? The selling of inspiration. Nothing like it. Nothing like it. You go down to the throat center, 71% defined, 29% of humanity undefined. You try to teach people how to get attention. It's a tough business. Own a media company, find out. Tough business. One of the toughest businesses on the planet is getting attention. Way down here at the bottom of the profit center. But oh boy, when we start up here at the head center, we're selling inspiration. We're going to give you what you need. We are. We're going to show you the past, offer you the future. Ponder the unknowables. This is what sells. Inspiration sells. And why? 79% of humanity is not self and is wandering around trying to find inspiration and trying to do something with it. Quit your job. Think about this. Forget about that. Here's something really inspiring for you. This head center. Everything about the mechanics is simple and obvious. There are two main profit centers. There are two basic profit centers. And you can see mechanically what the obvious is. We're dealing with the head center and we're dealing with the heart center. The head center only has 3 gates. The heart center only has 4 gates. They are by far the least accessible of the centers, and therefore, in terms of statistics, they are the least defined and fixed. And so what that means is that when you're dealing with the heart center and you're dealing with the ego, 65% of humanity, 3.8 billion people, 65% of humanity has an undefined ego. What's the not-self strategy of the undefined ego? That the undefined ego has something to prove. And so the mind is making decisions based on, I'm going to do this because I can prove myself. I'm going to do that because I can prove myself. In the meantime, they're missing their whole life. Yet at the same time, we can see that one of the biggest profit centers on the planet is helping people prove themselves. Training them, guiding them, motivating them, massaging them. On and on and on and on and on. And we well know in design the nature of the ego and its materialness, how deeply rooted it is to the material maintenance of the community, of the tribe. So when you're dealing with these two centers, the 7 gates of those centers, these are primary material gates. Primary. Oh, it's so funny the way things work. It really is. You see, look, if I teach you what this is, you realize what I'm doing. It's really insane. I'm saying to you, look, you can make money by keeping everybody not self. You know why I didn't want to teach this course? It's insane. It really is. But then again, I'm retired. I can afford to be a little insane now. But you really have to see the joke in that. It's a terrible joke, right? It says, look, I'm going to make a fortune. You stay dumb. Just stay stupid, because if you stay stupid, I'm going to make a lot of money off of you. I mean, it's a great joke. If I really had to teach you what true business looked like, of the true self, maybe one day I'd do that. It would really be hilarious. you know, because it's something else entirely. Then we're dealing with pentaland, and pentaland is another land. But anyway, okay. Remember that this course is about your individual potential. Ultimately, I have to give you the background first, but to really see that. Okay, so we can see very clearly that the open head center, the open ego center, that they represent deep potential for material. I sell inspiration. I'm an open head center. I sell inspiration. You know, I sell the question. You know, it's part of my material trip. It's part of what makes me successful materially. If you look at my design, you're not looking at somebody who's here to make money. I mean, if I'm living out my individual whatever, I'm just killing and eating. I don't have a job, you know? I mean, you really have to see that when you look at your design, when you actually look at your design, if you're truly just living out your design, and remember, we're not here to do that. We're here to live our design and embrace the shadow. And it's through the shadow we maintain our life. And until the critical mass of this planet changes, there is no embarrassment in making money from the not self. If in fact, what you're offering can transform them. But you know, the reality is that we're never going to get rid of them on this planet. There's always going to be these ways, these specific ways on the material plane that we live in to recognize where we can have impact and effect. Okay. Now, you notice I have a defined ego. I don't teach anybody that they have something to prove. You know? That wouldn't sell. You know, it wouldn't sell. You know, the other things that I have that are open, they sell. Okay, so let's move through here. We can see right away, and we'll focus on this when we go through the line level, we'll see that in terms of the head and the ego, they dominate. There's no question about that. So those two areas become very significant. They become very important to deal with. Middle ground is the solar plex and the ajna. Now remember something, if you're looking at the solar plex, half of humanity is undefined emotionally, and we know that the strategy of the open solar plex center is that the open solar plex center avoids confrontation and truth. So the mind representing that not self, the decisions will be based on avoiding confrontation and truth. I don't want to get into that because I don't want to get into that. And away they go into something else. The thing to recognize, of course, is that dealing with confrontation and finding truth is something really extraordinary. And not only that, but confrontation that brings pleasure, there's a sexual center, you know, confrontation that brings pleasure in terms of food. You know, there's all kinds of ways through the solar plex center in which bringing people together so that truth can come out. You know, this is part of the way in which money is made. In that sense, the material plane works out of the emotional system. You know, my thing is that this is one of my great selling points. I can reach half of humanity with that. You know, half of humanity, I can reach them and I can say, hey, look, you really need to confront the truth of what you are. You know, that's the selling point. And if you confront the truth of who you are, you will find the pleasure of what it is to be you. And you'll eat in a more healthy way, and your sex life will be better, and blah, 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 blah. And all of that is part of my pitch. You know? And you emotional people bought into it. Do you know what I mean? You really have to see it's very simple the way that it works. It's not contrived. This is the natural way in which we operate. And you see, if you're being conditioned by your not self, you will never, ever, ever get to make the money that's possible in the not self realm. It's only when you're wise about the not self, it's only when you're following your own clear authority that you can, in your wisdom, recognize how to make money out of that. I mean, remember, this is one of the most important things about an open center, is that the moment that you get past it controlling your decision making, which means that you don't let your mind make decisions for you anymore, That's the moment that these open centers become a place of wisdom. Now that wisdom translates into many things. It's not simply about being able to understand what an emotional wave is as it comes into your body, recognizing it's not yours, becoming more subtle and recognizing the different kinds of emotions that you take in, but eventually recognizing what emotional people need. I mean, what the work I've done with emotional beings, with the wave, with that whole process, with trying to bring clarity and understanding into the emotional being's life so they recognize what clarity is, they recognize how their awareness works. That's a great selling point. Do you know what I mean? It comes out of the wisdom, it comes out of the open center. Okay, so half of humanity is open to the solar plex market as a profit center. Here, beside it, the ajna. And it's interesting to note that it's easier to sell inspiration than it is to sell concepts. Inspiration is almost a dime a dozen. So we've got this vast, look at modern marketing. It's all trying to inspire the buyer. It's all about, we're doing the same thing. We're trying to inspire people. Human design is good for you, blah, 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 blah. But when you're trying to sell a concept, whoa, there's a majority that doesn't want it. 49% of humanity is still a lot of people. We're still talking about over 3 billion people. 49% of humanity is open to concept. Now, when you think about that, this is basically intellectual training systems. People with open minds are natural fodder to be seduced into all kinds of educational training, endless, all that stuff. And of course, there are those who directly benefit by being able to provide all of that. But the selling of concepts, again, the moment we're changing into a more complex center, it's like we go into the solar plex center and we see there's 7 very distinct ways in which the solar plex as a profit center operates. So each center that we're going to look at, there are different dynamics, obviously, that are at work. When you're dealing with the ajna, you're dealing with 6 in that sense. So we're dealing with different sub-themes, and those sub-themes are most importantly read through circuitry and circuit keynotes, because circuit keynotes tell you something about the nature of the thematic. The individual circuitry empowers. So this is a specific kind of product or service. It's an empowering product or service. When you're dealing with the collective, you're dealing with sharing. This is the kind of thing that bonds communities together by having shared values, shared products, shared services, shared this, shared that. And when you're dealing with tribal circuitry, you're dealing with support. And so much of what is now very successful in the world, what we're a part of, the so-called self-help industry, all of those kinds of things, the financial industry, the banking, all of that is built into the tribal and the support themes. Something we'll return to, because those simple keynotes are very important to keep in mind when we're going to look at the gates within the centers, because it allows us to see how the profit center differentiates through different themes. So, for example, the 61 of empowerment, and the 2, 63, 64, which are collective and sharing, you can see that inspiration is not supportive. It's not supportive at all. Either are concepts. They're not supportive. And you're going to have problems if you're trying to inspire people, that what you're going to offer them is really supportive. They don't buy that. They'll buy what you can sell them. They won't buy that. Okay. Then we begin at, again, this is just drawn for you so that you can see this movement going down the scaling of the statistics. We come to the splenic center. Now, this is very important in terms of the so-called healing profession. You can see that 47% of humanity, so again, we're dealing with a vast number in the billions, that 47% of humanity is holding on to things that are bad for them. Hey, this is the strategy of the open spleen, holding on to things that are bad for you. So I'm going to hold on to daddy even though daddy is abusing me, because as long as daddy's in my aura, I feel secure, even though daddy's a beast. And of course we know what happens, that the mind takes over as the propagandist of the not self, and the mind is always in there ready to say, we're still going to hold on to this even though it's bad for us, and so forth and so on. So you can see that the market here, the market is about getting people to move away from holding on to things that are bad for them. And by the way, because the spleen is about survival, you know, that this takes us into not only the health field, but it takes us into all kinds of things. Consultancy, it takes us into all kinds of areas that are there in which the product is getting people away from things that aren't good for them. Now, it's not about healing people that are already sick. It's one of my long-standing things about humanity and health. You know, this is about keeping people educated so that they have a holistic and healthy life. Learning how to keep away from themselves what is bad for them. And of course, this is something very special about, you know, the marketplace of the open spleen. But remember, we're dealing with a spleen that has a deep tribal aspect to it, and a deep tribal aspect that is deeply capitalistic, is very materialistic. In other words, to be very clear that though a lot of this has to do with the immune system and well-being, you know, it also has to do with a lot of other things. It has to do with the fact that capitalism does not survive without deep support within the community. You cannot impose capitalism from the top down. It's a disaster. It's a disaster. It has to be imposed from the bottom up, you know, because it is natural for us to barter. It is the most natural thing in human beings, you know, and to barter for gain, you know, and it's the illusion of gain that both sides get in a fair barter, you know, and all of that is rooted in the basis of the tribe and the basis of the development of the tribe. So when we're dealing with the spleen, 47% in terms of its capacity to be a profit center. The next step is the G center. And again, with the G center, we can see the progression of the statistics. We have 56% definition in the G. That means that 44% of humanity is undefined and 44% of humanity is still looking for love and the right direction. So this is a great market. You can sell maps. You know, you can run pornographic internet sites. You can run, counseling for partnerships. You can run dating services. It goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And again, you can see what happens to the not-self in those situations is that the not-self is saying, oh, I'm looking for the right direction. And there's always somebody who'll say, yes, for a fee, I will take you to the right place. You know, this is the nature of the world, and they're always going to meet the person that'll sell it to them. Have you ever noticed that the moment that you decide you want to buy something, you meet somebody who's selling it? It's one of those bizarre things about life. You know, because it's just in the mechanics. You know, it's like people who say, well, what's it like when, you know, the other end of that gate gets connected? You're going to meet it all the time, you know? I mean, we're meeting these things all the time, so we have these natural receptors, we're pulling it in. Okay, so there's the G center. We go down from the G center, we go to the root. 58% defined, so we've got 42%. We have 42%. Now remember, the root center is this is one of my favorites, eh? Look, the not-self strategy of the root center is, I'm going to do this as quick as I can to be free. Okay? I'm going to get rid of the pressure that way. I'm going to do it as quick as I can to be free. I'm going to do it as quick as I can to be free. Okay? Oh, I got this vacation spot, and what you can sell these people is amazing. Pensions, you can sell them dreams, you can sell them anything, and more than that, you can burden them like no one else. You know, if you get through all of this, you're going to be free. You know, you're going to be free. You're going to have this little cottage there. You know, all you got to do is give us a certain amount of your time, your money, your life, whatever the case may be. Anyway, the root center in a hurry to be free. Now, I got an open root. That's what I sell you. I sell you a quick way to be free. Quick, 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 quick. You're a generator? Respond. Out the door. Goodbye. Quick, quick, quick. Get it over with. It was like my readings, you know? They got so compressed, you know, that I go, well, okay, bye. Quick, done, over. Whew, you're free now. You know how many people are selling freedom? There are so many freedom salespeople in the world. Politicians, eh? Georgie Bush is trying to sell freedom to the Iraqis. I love it, and there's all these kids looting buildings, right? You're free! Okay, let's steal. You know? Great, eh? Okay, open root center. How nice. Anyway, next, sacral. Oh, sacral. It's a lousy market. Really, it's a lousy market. If it weren't for the fact that it keeps the whole plant operating, we would actually downsize them, you know? Make them redundant, you know? This is not a good profit center. You know, which means that projectors, oh God, and reflectors and manifestors, you know, it's like, shit, you know? What are we going to do with this? Eh? You know what they do? You see, when a generator comes into the world and they turn the switch, it's like, okay, start working. You know? As soon as they come into the world, start working. Eh? Well, you got an open sacral center, you come into the world as anything but a generator. You come into the world and the first thing you say is, don't turn on that switch. I am not here to work, period. Right? Right. Okay. And we know that the not-self strategy of the open sacral is not knowing when enough is enough. Right? Okay. Guess what you can sell out of an open sacral? I can sell to all the generators on earth to stop what they're doing. Enough now. Enough of being not self. Enough of being stupid. Enough of being an idiot. You know, enough of being a moron. You know, here you are, the great, exalted, mystical. You see the shit that I sell to generators? You're the only holy people. And they love it, eh? Oh, it's really good. Yeah, I'm holy, eh? To know when enough is enough, it's not a good market. You ever try to get a generator to wake up? You can understand it's not a good market. I've spent years trying to have impact on that market. You know, and there they are. No, it's not enough yet. It's not enough yet. It's not enough yet. It's not enough yet. Throat centers. The worst market of all. Eh? I mean, only 29% of humanity have an open throat. And we know that the strategy, the not-self strategy of the open throat is that, you know, you have to attract attention. Open throat, people are always trying to attract attention. Always. And of course, that's the way their mind's going to work. You know, I'm going to do this because it attracts attention, or I'm going to do that because it attracts attention, so forth and so on. So one of the things to see is that the selling of attracting attention has a small market. How to teach people with an open throat. You know, literally, they're the ones who want to know, how do I attract attention? You understand how insane this is? If you teach somebody with an open throat how to attract attention, you're teaching them how to be better furniture. You're not waking them up. Well, you're not. You know, somebody comes to me with an open throat and I say, look, pay me a fortune and you can attract attention too. You know? Let me show you how. You know? And then they just paint on this layer onto their not self, you know, and they think they've learned how to attract attention. See, I've had a real privilege in my life to be raised wealthy, to lose and give up, and to have everything taken away, to be with absolutely nothing for years, and then to watch through all of this process material move. My whole market has been the not-self. There's no true selves for me to sell. I wouldn't bother. Don't have anything to sell them. Nothing. It's one of the ironies of my life, is that in order for human design to be a success, I had to sell the not-self. Not in the way that I personally train anybody. Not in the way that anybody comes through this knowledge. But in the way in which the understanding of what these kinds of things are all about. My appeal, my ability, human design's ability up until a few days ago, because it was rooted in my design, was all about taking advantage of those themes in me that are not self. I used my shadow. I dressed in black. Used my shadow to pull in the not self world. Just shadow. You know, money's a funny thing. It's just there. For me, it's prana. You know, it's clear to me that it's nothing more than prana. I am what I am and I breathe. I breathe it in, I breathe it out. I breathe it in, I breathe it out. And that's just the way it is. You know, but the reality is we don't live in a world like that. We don't. You know, it's always, you know, it's why I've held back so long in teaching this kind of a course. You know, to really be able to understand that our whole concept of the material plane, our whole idea about money and what money is and how all of this works, you know, it's all a lie. I mean, after all, the 70% of humanity that are generators generate the pattern that is life. They generate the pattern that is life. We know the generators, the not-self, is deeply frustrated, that the material plane of our lives are deeply frustrated, that we do not operate correctly on this plane. And if we operated correctly on this plane, you know, nobody would be without. Nobody. And not that it would be some kind of socialist utopia. It has nothing to do with that. It's simply that nobody would really be without. There's always a hierarchy. There's always this and that. There's always comparison in the uniqueness. There's always this spectrum that is there in humanity. But it's not about having nothing. It's not about suffering. It's not about the deep frustration of 3 billion people on this planet who are hungry every night. You know, it's not about that. And yet at the same time, when I open up these mechanics, what I'm really showing you is that the only way you're going to make money within the context of the plane we're living on is that you do make money by reinforcing the not-self of others. Now, I'm not talking about us. Because after all, our job is to take people away from that. But you really have to understand that we're an anomaly anyway. You know, we are a new fractal. You know, but the reality is for millennia and millennia, it is the not-self interrelationship that created the material plane. You know, so see both sides in this. Don't delight too much in understanding how this works. You know? Because it's something to recognize that it's part of the problem. Okay, so the final one is the throat. So I want you to have this sense that when you're looking here, that you really begin to understand something about the way in which we work, is that these receptors within us, these receptors give us our life, Maya. You know, without our receptors, there would be no life. You know, the receptors open us up to the other, open us up to the world. But in opening us up, it also defines what we're going to meet. It defines what we're going to meet. And at the moment that you begin to see the potential that lies in your open centers or your open gates or your open channels, then you begin to see what the material possibilities are for you. Because that's where you can be wise and where at the same time you're guaranteed in your life to be attracting the other forces. Guaranteed. See, if we lived in an ideal environment, if everybody was living out their nature, if we were operating correctly in the hierarchy, if the manifestors were operating at peace amongst themselves, if projectors and generators were operating in harmony, then reflectors would be able to determine worth. Worth. You know, if I'm going to have a corporation, I'm going to want a projector at the top of that corporation, and I'm going to want a reflector that looks after what people earn, what they earn. See, the reflector is supposed to be the role of a justice. That is, their place is that they are here to know the community. They are here to know the they of their milieu. And they're here to recognize value within the milieu. But obviously we don't operate that way. I mean, we don't. And so we have these arbitrary, ways in which we determine what the value of somebody's work is. Somebody who's doing the same job in the first world and in the third world. If you're working at a steel plant in Germany and you're working at a steel plant in Thailand and you're both doing the same job, I guarantee you that the German worker is making at least 4 times as much. At least. So, we don't have a sense of justice in that sense. Because that steel worker in Germany is not worth more money than that steel worker in Thailand. They're not. So, we don't have a system in which we have a general justice. For example, one of my complaints for years was that women are not paid the same amount of as men in the same job, which always seemed insane to me. I mean, a job is a job is a job, and it's the same kind of question. It's the same kind of thing. In other words, that it's the not-self that's deciding values. It's the not-self that's doing that. It's not being done in a way that is correct in that sense. Okay, so that's the first thing, to look at the centers and to see through the centers that we have our little profit centers. Third line. The process that I'm going to take you through is that I'm going to take you through a unique analysis of third lines in all of the 64 gates. Everything about the third line is that the third line is the only line that is mutative. That's the first thing to recognize in its chemistry. Third lines are mutative, and third lines are the only lines that are specifically about the material. Now remember that when we're looking at a hexagram, that we are looking at a complex dynamic. And what I want you to understand from my analysis over the days of the third line is to understand a thematic value expressed in the third line that expresses the material value of the whole hexagram. Just as the fourth line will express the personal influence of the whole hexagram, or the fifth line will express the universalized impact of the whole hexagram. It's very important to see that when I'm discussing these third lines, yes, it will be more impactful if you have a third line that is activated in your design. But the fact that you have the first line or the second line, for example, I only have one gate in the head center. I have it unconscious. It's my design sun. It's the 61-1, occult knowledge. It's not a third line. It's not. What I sell is the deep investigation of the occult. That's my inspiration. My inspiration is that I can take you in at the investigative level. But as you will see when we go to look at the hexagram, the theme of how that works is going to be expressed by the third line. So in other words, I want you to see that as I'm describing how the third line works, I want you to see that what I'm describing is the general thematic out of that third line that expresses the whole hexagram. Obviously, first, second, fourth, fifth, sixth lines will operate within that third theme, but will operate in different ways. The 1 and the 3 is a dissonance. So is the 2 and the 3. So is the 4 and the 3. So is the 5 and the 3. The 6 and the 3 isn't. So the 6 line in any hexagram is going to have a deeper relationship to the 3rd line theme and so forth and so on. But still, regardless of what line you have, that 3rd line theme is going to define the material nature, and that's the most important thing to grasp. It's going to define the material nature of the hexagram as a whole. We've looked at many things in terms of the nature of the 3rd line. That is, we begin with the fact that the 3rd line has this quality to be able to adapt. Now, this is one of the things to recognize about the material plane, is that the material plane is mutative. If you don't adapt, you die. In other words, that it is one of the things to recognize that, well, it's very simple. If you cannot embrace failure, you will never be a success. If you cannot embrace the possibility of failure, you can never be a success. Not possible. And this is one of the inherent things about the nature of the 3rd line and its depth. So important to recognize that about the 3rd line. Is that the 3rd line accepts, has to, that life is mistakes. That life can be discovery. We're always impressed, no matter where we come from, when somebody discovers something, a technique, a product, or whatever, and overnight they become this enormous success. And then we hear the heartbreaking story of how they did it. They were in the garage for 6 years, and, all of that stuff. And they had so many failures until they threw the bubble gum in the pot and everything changed. And, the trial and error, fight your way through. And all of the mythology about, oh, my father, I was a great disappointment. I was lazy and shiftless, and I was a bum, and, I was only interested in sex and music, and I wanted to dance naked in the sun, and he kept on saying to me, but only when you work, and you work hard at something, are you really going to see how good that feels and the reward of it, and blah, 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 blah. And I said, yeah, man, yeah. I'll see you after my next acid trip, And of course, that cliche is a 3rd line cliche. It's a 3rd line cliche that after 10 trial and error blunders, they finally get it. And it's like, yes, we've mastered it now. There's this wonderful capacity in them. And so it's something to understand about the nature of the material way, is that the material way is not easy. And that you have to deal with the fact that you may fail. That you have to deal with the fact that things will not go the way you want. But if you are ready to adapt, then what happens to you out of that, what you learn, this can bring you enormous benefit. This is, I'm giving you some cross references here of 3rd line themes, because I want you to see how deep it runs within us. And when you're looking at the 3rd line theme in the mystical grid, this is a profile grid of the mystical way. When you're looking at this, you see that 3rd lines are interpreted as attunement. This pressure, by the way, has to do with the fact that it has to do with the 19th gate, this illustration. It's attunement. It's in being in tune. And it's not so much being in tune the way you're in tune as a classical musician with the music written in front of you. No. This is jazz by ear. And you stay attuned. And only if you have that attention, that you stay attuned. People will talk about their material life humming along. There's a nice piece of music to it. It's about being attuned. And when you're attuned, the moment that there's a shift, you can go with it. Suddenly the saxophone player takes off, without telling anybody. And there's the bass player and the drummer catching up. And the piano player finally gets into line. And away they go, and they got a whole new track. And by the way, the audience is there going, wow, that was great. How'd you do that? Can you do it again? You know, this is all about being attuned. So if you cannot adapt, if you cannot handle the pressure of failure, if you cannot be attuned, you're going to have trouble. You know, because this is the heart of what the material way is all about. You see what happens to people. My joy is in entrepreneurship. I have enormous respect for it. I think it's a very courageous way of working in the world. And, you know, when you look at that, and I look at what it is to take on that whole burden, you see that people are totally absorbed. I mean, they're totally absorbed. If you work for yourself, you work 60% more than you would ever work for any boss. And you do it with joy. This is the attunement, you know. You go sailing right in there. Sometimes you're so deeply focused that you forget to see that the world is changing around you, you know, and you need to adapt and you need to do this. But, you know, it's all about staying attuned and being absorbed. You know, again, you can never separate the mundane from the mystical. After all, you know, it's something to understand that everything that you need is there and is coming to your openness. You know, it's there. It's there. I have never had to look for pleasure in my life. Never, 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 never. I have an open emotional system. I have met pleasure all my life. I never had to look for it. Never. You know, I have to teach emotional people where to find pleasure. Can you imagine? I've never had to look for it. Pleasure meets me everywhere. Huh? Okay. Attunement. Now we get to the funny stuff. This is a pyramid that's bandaged. Anyway. In the mechanics of the sleeping life, when we're looking at the third line, and remember in the mechanics of sleeping life, you're horizontal, you're working out of a 16-gate mammalian matrix, what we call dream rave. When you're looking at the third line, you see what makes the material plane so difficult. Because the third line is turmoil. Turmoil. And you see, most human beings do not suffer over the material plane while they're awake. Most people suffer over the material plane when they're asleep. When they're asleep. This is when you wake up in the middle of the night or you wake up early in the morning and there's this shock. Oh, Jesus, I forgot. Whoa, I better do that now. You know? And you're out the door in the office and it's 3:45. You know, there isn't even a bar open. You know, nothing. The turmoil. See, the not-self really thinks that it's in charge. So the moment that the not-self is involved in that way, the turmoil that's at work, you know, is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. See, this is one of the things about being correct. It's one of the things that I constantly talk about in terms of sleep patterns. You know, you really have to recognize that sacral beings and non-sacral beings have to go to sleep differently and in their own spaces. You know, generators can only go to sleep when they're exhausted. We all know that. Simple. Non-sacral beings must get into bed, must be horizontal before they go to sleep. You know, so they have time, half hour, whatever it takes. Very, very different mechanisms. If you're not sleeping correctly, according to being sacral or non-sacral, you're going to have even more turmoil that's going to take place while you're asleep. And you're going to wake up with that as part of that whole third line theme. So it's something to keep in mind that, you know, we're not just talking about the third line and the fact that the way in which it's going to impact us in our waking life, but to see that it's there in the unconscious and at the, at the sleeping level, and at the sleeping level to recognize that it's not a nice frequency. It's not. It's turmoil. And of course, you can imagine that for most of humanity, who has a great deal of trouble on the material plane, that there is real, genuine turmoil in that awakening. I mean, wow, you know, where am I going to get, let alone, you know, whether the cash machine's going to be open, where am I going to find enough rice to feed my kids? Where am I going to find the firewood just to make the fire so that I can cook whatever is there, and so forth and so on? What I want to show you here is just a little illustration here to keep in mind the nature of third lines as we're going to examine them. Everything about the third line, the behavioral identity of the third line is martyr. The material way. When you're asleep, it's turmoil. When you're awake, it's all about attunement and adaptation. And yet the behavioral identity is that you're a martyr. Now, a martyr is somebody who stands up for their principles. It's somebody who's willing to face willing to face others who think differently and so forth and do differently and so forth and so on. And it's one of the things to understand about the nature of the third line is that it's fundamentally innovative. It's innovative. In other words, it's standing for something, it's bringing something new. Third lines love new and improved. We've adapted. We've been attuned to your needs and we've improved our product for you. And if you look at the longevity of certain brands, you'll see that the same brand has survived through being improved year after year. Just about every cereal box you ever look at has a line across it that says new and improved. There's more fruit, there's more this, there's more that, there's more whatever the case may be. It's something to understand about the martyr, because everybody thinks about the martyr, you're Jesus on the cross. It is about standing up for your principle. And so, willing to stand up to your principle even though you may fail. The average person who goes out on a cold call, to sell something to somebody, the chances are 1 out of 30 people are going to throw you away. To be able to deal with rejection. Nobody deals with rejection better than a martyr. Yes, they don't love my product, but I know it's the right product, and I'm going to keep on going until I'm in bankruptcy court. The projected attitude, anarchist. Now, this is something very important because this is the key to understanding the third line in anyone's psychology. That is to recognize that the third line is here to discover what doesn't work. That's why it can be materially successful. It discovers what doesn't work, it improves it. Okay, it does a better job, what we used to call knockoffs. Somebody would have a product over here and somebody over there would do it faster, cheaper. This whole business, and it's very important to see this is the anarchy at work. Remember, anarchy is the recognition of what does not function and the tearing down of it. In other words, the need to replace it. So we have this progression that's built into this projected attitude. It's the progression that says, yeah, but that's last year's refrigerator. It's dead. It's junk. Get rid of it. Let's get a new generation of this and a new generation of that. In other words, again, at the material level, to recognize an anarchist is something else. Anarchist is the thing that keeps the fashion industry going. How dare